Red and blue lights danced across the midnight blue hood of the $500,000 Rolls-Royce Phantom. To the patrol officer, the black man behind the wheel simply didn't belong in this zip code. He saw an easy arrest. He was about to discover he had just pulled over the billionaire owner of the city's most exclusive hotel. The crisp autumn air of the city held the faint, metallic scent of impending rain, but inside the cabin of the 2025 Rolls-Royce Phantom, the atmosphere was a sanctuary of climate-controlled perfection. Ronald Scott gripped the hand-stitched leather steering wheel, the bespoke interior smelling of rich mahogany and success. At 42, Ronald was a man who had forged his empire in the fires of sheer, unrelenting willpower. Raised in a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the south side of Chicago, he now stood as the founder and CEO of Scott Holdings, a private equity firm that had just executed the most aggressive real estate acquisition of the decade. Tonight was supposed to be a quiet victory lap. He was driving to the crown jewel of his new portfolio, the Grand Oakhaven Hotel, a historic five-star luxury establishment that catered strictly to old money, international diplomats, and A-list celebrities. The ink on the $400 million purchase agreement had dried less than 24 hours ago. Ronald hadn't even met the executive staff yet. He wanted to arrive unannounced, observe the nighttime operations as a regular guest, and feel the pulse of the property before turning it upside down. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal Tom Ford suit, a subtle Patek Philippe watch resting on his left wrist, quiet luxury that didn't need to scream to be heard. 2 blocks away, idling in the shadows of an old oak tree, sat Patrol Cruiser 44. Inside was Officer Thomas Riggins. Riggins was a 15-year veteran of the force, a man whose career had stalled out a decade ago due to a long, quietly buried file of citizen complaints. Riggins viewed the wealthy district not as a community to protect, but as a hunting ground where he was the unappreciated gatekeeper. He harbored a deep, simmering resentment for the world changing around him, clinging to outdated prejudices that he thinly veiled as good police instincts. As the massive, silent silhouette of the Rolls-Royce glided past the patrol car, Riggins's eyes narrowed. The streetlights illuminated the driver for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Riggins saw a black man. Then, he looked at the car, a $500,000 vehicle in an area where old, white, generational wealth usually resided behind heavily tinted Maybach windows. Riggins's radio crackled, but he ignored it, his jaw tightening. No way, he thought to himself. Not around here, not without a chauffeur's hat. He punched the license plate into his onboard terminal. The screen blinked, loading the registration data. It didn't come back to a specific individual. Instead, the registered owner was listed as Scott Corporate Trust, Tier 1 asset. To a seasoned, rational officer, a corporate trust registration on a luxury vehicle usually indicated a high-net-worth executive or a celebrity hiding behind an LLC for privacy. To Officer Riggins, it was a red flag of grand theft auto. He convinced himself instantly that this was a joyrider, a thief who had managed to bypass the electronic security of a high-end vehicle and was now parading around the richest neighborhood in the state. Riggins threw the cruiser into drive, pulling out into the street without his lights on, stalking the Phantom from a block behind. Ronald, entirely unaware of the predator in his rearview mirror, turned the heavy steering wheel, guiding the Rolls-Royce toward the magnificent, brilliantly lit archway of the Grand Oakhaven Hotel. The sweeping circular driveway was paved with imported cobblestone. The brass revolving doors gleamed under the warm glow of antique crystal chandeliers visible through the lobby windows. Just as the Rolls-Royce's tires kissed the cobblestone of the valet lane, the world behind Ronald exploded in a blinding array of flashing red and blue lights. The sharp, aggressive whoop-whoop of a police siren shattered the elegant tranquility of the hotel's entrance. Ronald glanced in his rearview mirror, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. He was perfectly within the lines, hadn't exceeded 20 miles per hour in the last 10 minutes, and was completely sober. He shifted the car into park, the spirit of ecstasy hood ornament retracting smoothly into the grille, and rolled down his window. Officer Riggins stepped out of his cruiser, his hand resting conspicuously on the butt of his service weapon. His posture was aggressive, his shoulders squared as he marched up to the driver's side window. He didn't bother with the standard polite greetings usually reserved for citizens in this zip code. "Turn the engine off and put your hands where I can see them," Riggins barked, shining his heavy tactical flashlight directly into Ronald's eyes, blinding him. Ronald squinted, shielding his face slightly with his left hand, while keeping his right clearly visible on the steering wheel. "The engine is off, officer. Is there a problem?" His voice was a deep, calm baritone, devoid of the panic Riggins usually expected and relished. "I said hands where I can see them," Riggins shouted, leaning closer to the window, his tone dripping with condescension. "Whose car is this, boy?" The word hung in the air, heavy and sharp. "Boy." Ronald's jaw clenched, but his years in high-stakes boardrooms had taught him an ironclad control over his emotions. He knew exactly what this was. He had spent his entire life outrunning this exact moment, building walls of wealth and status to shield himself from the indignity of the streets, only to find that the uniform of prejudice didn't care about his bespoke suit. "This is my vehicle, officer," Ronald replied, his voice dropping an octave, radiating a chilling authority. "And I would appreciate it if you lowered the flashlight. You are blinding me." Riggins let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He kept the beam fixed squarely on Ronald's face. "Your vehicle." "Right. And I'm the King of England. Let me see your license and registration. And move slow. Any sudden movements. And we're going to have a very bad night." Ronald reached slowly into his interior breast pocket. He withdrew a slim black leather card holder and produced his driver's license, handing it through the window. "The registration is digital, tied to the plates. It's owned by Scott Corporate Trust." Riggins snatched the license. He stepped back slightly, angling the flashlight to read the plastic card. Ronald Scott. He looked at the address, a multi-million-dollar estate in a gated community in the hills. Riggins sneered, his bias completely overriding his logic. "Ronald Scott, huh?" Riggins said, tapping the license against the roof of the Rolls-Royce, a calculated sign of disrespect to the pristine paint job. "You expect me to believe you live at this address. You expect me to believe you bought a $500,000 car. I expect you to run the license through your system," Ronald said smoothly. "You will find that it is valid, that I have no warrants, and that the corporate trust owning this vehicle is registered to my holding company. Once you verify that, I have a long evening ahead of me, and I would like to check into my hotel." "Your hotel?" Riggins scoffed, looking up at the towering, majestic facade of the Grand Oakhaven. "Right. Guys like you don't stay at the Oakhaven. Guys like you work the loading docks around back." "Officer," Ronald said, his tone turning to ice. "Run the name. Now." The command in Ronald's voice infuriated Riggins. Suspects were supposed to cower. They were supposed to stutter and plead. This man was giving him orders. Riggins unclipped his radio. "Dispatch. I need backup at the Oakhaven. Got a non-compliant suspect in a suspected stolen 10-85. Ronald shook his head slightly, a profound sense of exhaustion washing over him. The drama was entirely unnecessary, completely manufactured by a man too small for his badge. But as the sirens of an approaching backup unit began to wail in the distance, Ronald realized this was no longer just a traffic stop. It was a spectacle. The arrival of the backup cruiser shattered whatever remained of the hotel's serene atmosphere. A younger officer, Officer Miller, jumped out, looking nervously between the imposing Rolls-Royce, his senior partner, and the gathering crowd. The valet attendants, young men in pristine crimson vests with gold braiding, had frozen in their tracks. A family of wealthy tourists from London, standing near the brass luggage carts, stopped to point and whisper. The valet captain, a 22-year-old named Toby, stood closest to the Rolls-Royce, his eyes wide with shock. He had recognized the car immediately. The general manager had circulated a memo earlier that day stating the new owner of the hotel might arrive in a custom midnight blue Phantom. Toby knew exactly who was in that driver's seat, but he was paralyzed by the presence of the aggressively shouting police officer. "Step out of the vehicle!" Riggins bellowed, stepping back and resting his hand firmly on his holster. "I said step out of the vehicle, now!" Ronald looked at Riggins, then at the younger officer. He knew the statistics. He knew how quickly a bruised ego with a badge could turn lethal. He slowly pushed the heavy door open, stepping out onto the cobblestone. Under the brilliant lights of the hotel marquee, Ronald Scott was an imposing figure. Standing 6'2", impeccably dressed, he emanated power and composure. He did not look like a car thief. He looked like a man who owned the city block. But prejudice is a powerful blinder, and Riggins saw only what he wanted to see. "Turn around. Hands on the roof of the car," Riggins ordered. "Officer Riggins," Ronald said, reading the man's name tag. "I strongly advise you to de-escalate this situation. You are making a monumental mistake that will have severe consequences for your career." "Is that a threat?" Riggins snarled, closing the distance. He grabbed Ronald violently by the shoulder, spinning him around and shoving him chest first against the side of the Rolls-Royce. "You're threatening a police officer?" "I am stating a fact," Ronald replied, his cheek pressed against the cool metal of his car. He didn't struggle. He let Riggins aggressively kick his legs apart. "You are violating my civil rights based on a racial assumption. Run the plates through a supervisor. Look up Scott Holdings." "Shut your mouth!" Riggins snapped, pulling his handcuffs from his belt. The heavy metal ratchets clicked ominously in the cool night air. "You're under arrest for grand theft auto, possession of stolen property, and resisting an officer." Officer Miller, the younger cop, stepped forward hesitantly. "Hey, Tom, maybe we should run the name through the MDC first?" The plate came back to a trust, not stolen. "I know what I'm doing, Miller," Riggins barked, twisting Ronald's right arm forcefully behind his back, causing a sharp twinge of pain to shoot through Ronald's shoulder. "This guy's a professional. Fake ID, rehearsed story. He probably swiped the keys from a valet lockbox." The crowd had grown. A few guests had pulled out their smartphones, the red recording lights blinking in the darkness. Inside the Grand Oakhaven, the atmosphere was a stark contrast of controlled panic. Richard Harrington, the general manager of the hotel, was a man who lived and died by protocol. At 55, impeccably groomed with silver hair and a tailored morning coat, Richard had spent the last 2 days in a state of high anxiety. The sale of the Oakhaven to Scott Holdings had sent shockwaves through the staff. Rumors of mass firings and corporate restructuring were rampant. Richard had been informed that Mr. Ronald Scott, the ruthless and brilliant billionaire CEO, would be arriving unannounced sometime this week to inspect the property. Richard was at the concierge desk, berating a junior staff member about the alignment of the floral arrangements, when a frantic bellhop sprinted through the revolving doors. "Mr. Harrington." "Mr. Harrington, sir," the boy gasped, his face pale. "There's a police incident outside. They've got a guy pinned against a car in the valet circle." Richard's face flushed with immediate anger. "A police incident? At our front door. This is a 5-star establishment, not a dive bar. Get security out there immediately and clear the driveway." Richard briskly walked toward the front entrance, adjusting his silk tie. He intended to give the police officers a piece of his mind regarding discretion and the disruption of his guests' peace. As he punched through the heavy, revolving brass doors, the cool night air hit him, followed immediately by the chaotic scene. He saw the flashing lights. He saw the crowd of whispering guests. He saw the 2 police cruisers blocking the entrance. Then he saw the car, a custom, midnight blue 2025 Rolls-Royce Phantom. Richard's heart dropped into his stomach. The corporate liaison for Scott Holdings had sent a highly confidential dossier to Richard just yesterday. It included Mr. Scott's dietary preferences, his preferred room temperature, and the specific make, model, and license plate of his personal vehicle to ensure VIP valet treatment. Richard's eyes snapped from the car to the man currently being violently handcuffed against it. Even from behind, pressed against the metal, the man's suit was undeniably bespoke. "Oh my God," Richard whispered, the blood draining completely from his face. He broke into a run, his polished dress shoes slipping slightly on the cobblestone. "Stop! Stop this instantly!" Richard screamed, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated panic. He shoved his way past the gawking tourists and the frozen valet attendants. Officer Riggins had just clicked the second cuff onto Ronald's left wrist, yanking his arms up uncomfortably high. He turned, glaring at the approaching hotel manager. "Back up, sir. This is an active police scene. Have you lost your mind?" Richard shrieked, skidding to a halt inches from Riggins. He looked at Ronald, recognizing the face from the Forbes magazine cover that sat on his office desk. "Mr. Scott, I am so incredibly sorry," Richard stammered, his hands hovering in the air as if he wanted to magically dissolve the handcuffs. Riggins frowned, looking between the frantic hotel manager and the man he had just arrested. "You know this suspect?" Richard turned on Riggins, his eyes blazing with the fury of a man whose career was currently flashing before his eyes. "Suspect! Suspect! You absolute imbecile! Release him this instant! Do you have any idea what you are doing?" "Sir, step back," Riggins warned, puffing out his chest. "This man is driving a stolen vehicle. He's under arrest." "He is not driving a stolen vehicle," Richard bellowed, his voice echoing loudly across the valet circle, silencing the murmurs of the crowd. Every phone camera was now pointed directly at them. Richard pointed a trembling finger at Ronald. "This is Ronald Scott. He is the CEO of Scott Holdings. He doesn't just own that car, officer. He owns this entire hotel." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, mocking click-clack of a woman's heels on the pavement and the low hum of the idling police cruisers. Officer Riggins froze. His hand, still gripping the chain of the handcuffs, went slack. He looked at Richard, waiting for the punchline, waiting for the hotel manager to realize he was being fooled. But Richard's face held only sheer terror and absolute certainty. Riggins slowly turned his head to look at Ronald. Ronald turned his head slightly, meeting the officer's eyes. Despite being in handcuffs, despite being pressed against a car, Ronald looked entirely in control. The calm, icy composure he had maintained throughout the entire ordeal now made terrifying sense to the officer. It wasn't the calm of a hardened criminal. It was the calm of a billionaire who knew he possessed the power to dismantle a man's life with a single phone call. "I told you, officer," Ronald said softly, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet night. "You are making a monumental mistake." Riggins swallowed hard. The thick, arrogant wall of prejudice that had driven his actions for the last 20 minutes suddenly cracked, letting in a flood of cold, paralyzing reality. The silence in the valet circle was deafening. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that precedes a catastrophic storm. Officer Thomas Riggins stared at Richard Harrington, the general manager of the Grand Oakhaven, waiting for the punchline. He waited for the wealthy, impeccably dressed hotelier to start laughing, to clap him on the shoulder and commend his sharp police work. Instead, Richard was trembling, his face a mask of absolute horror. "Take the cuffs off him," Richard demanded, his voice dropping to a frantic, breathless whisper. "Take them off right now, you idiot." Riggins looked down at his hands. He was still holding the metal chain connecting the cuffs around Ronald Scott's wrists. The cold reality of the situation began to seep through the thick armor of his prejudice. He looked at the bespoke suit he had just shoved against the car. He looked at the calm, terrifyingly composed black man who was supposedly a car thief. He didn't have his registration," Riggins stammered, his voice suddenly lacking its previous boom. It sounded thin, reedy, and desperate. "The car is registered to a trust. It's standard procedure, too." "Standard procedure?" Officer Miller, the younger rookie, finally spoke up. He had retreated to his cruiser the moment Richard started screaming and had quickly typed the name Ronald Scott into his mobile data computer. Miller jogged back over, holding a tablet. His face was pale. "Tom, look at this." Riggins glanced at the glowing screen. There, staring back at him, was a high-resolution photograph of the man currently handcuffed to the Rolls-Royce. The headline beneath the photo, pulled from a recent Financial Times database, read, "Ronald Scott, CEO of Scott Holdings, closes $400 million acquisition of historic Oakhaven property." The tablet slipped from Riggins's fingers, clattering onto the cobblestone. The illusion of his authority shattered instantly. The crowd of onlookers, mostly wealthy patrons and tourists with their smartphones raised, had captured every second of it. The flashing red and blue lights now felt less like a symbol of law and order and more like a neon sign broadcasting Riggins's monumental failure. "Sir, Mr. Scott," Riggins began, his hands shaking as he reached for the key on his duty belt. "There has been a misunderstanding, a breakdown in communication. Do not touch me," Ronald commanded. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried a lethal authority that froze Riggins in his tracks. "Sir, I just need to get the cuffs off," I said. "Do not touch me," Ronald repeated, turning his head to look Riggins dead in the eye. "You put them on, but you will not take them off. Officer Miller, I want you to call your watch commander. I want a captain down here immediately. Until a senior commanding officer arrives to witness this exact scene, these cuffs stay exactly where they are." "Mr. Scott, please," Richard pleaded, wringing his hands. "Let's just step inside. We can sort this out in my office. We don't need a spectacle." "The spectacle was initiated by this officer, Richard," Ronald replied coldly, addressing his new employee for the first time. "And I intend to see it through to its conclusion." For the next 20 minutes, Ronald Scott stood perfectly still, handcuffed against his own $500,000 vehicle. He didn't fidget. He didn't complain. He let the cameras roll. He let the guests whisper. He let the sheer, unadulterated humiliation of the situation wash over Officer Riggins, who stood a few feet away, sweating profusely in the cool autumn air, looking like a man standing on the gallows waiting for the lever to be pulled. When Captain Robert Hayes arrived, the screech of his unmarked SUV tires signaled the end of Riggins's career. Hayes was a 30-year veteran, a no-nonsense commander who spent half his time managing the precinct's public relations in the city's wealthiest district. Captain Hayes took one look at the scene, the Rolls-Royce, the handcuffed billionaire, the sweating patrolman, and closed his eyes in profound exhaustion. He walked directly to Ronald. "Mr. Scott, I am Captain Hayes," he said, pulling a universal cuff key from his pocket. "I cannot express how deeply I apologize for this. Turn around, please." Ronald complied. The heavy steel unclicked, and he slowly brought his arms forward, rubbing his wrists where the metal had dug into his skin. He adjusted his suit jacket, reclaiming his physical dignity. "Captain Hayes," Ronald said, his tone conversational but laced with venom. "I was pulled over without probable cause. I was blinded by a flashlight, addressed as boy, physically assaulted, and arrested for stealing my own property. Your officer refused to run my name or verify the corporate trust. He operated purely on racial profiling. I assure you, Mr. Scott, there will be a full internal investigation." "There will be much more than that, Captain," Ronald interrupted smoothly. He turned to look at Riggins, who was staring at the ground. "Officer Riggins, you thought you were protecting this neighborhood from someone who didn't belong. Let me make something absolutely clear to you. I don't just belong here. I own the ground you are standing on. And by the time my legal team is finished with you, you will understand exactly what it means to cross a man who builds empires for a living." Ronald turned on his heel. "Richard, have valet park the car. I'll take the penthouse suite." Without a backward glance, Ronald walked through the brass revolving doors, leaving a shattered police officer and a stunned crowd in his wake. By 8 a.m. the next morning, the video was everywhere. Dubbed the Oakhaven incident by the morning news anchors, the footage of a white police officer violently handcuffing a black billionaire against a Rolls-Royce went viral with explosive speed. It was a perfect, terrible storm of race, class, and absolute incompetence. Ronald Scott did not go to the media. He didn't issue a tearful statement or go on a morning talk show. He went to his corner office on the 50th floor of the Scott Holdings Tower, poured himself a black coffee, and summoned his legal team. Leading the charge was Arthur Pendleton, a ruthless, high-powered civil rights and corporate litigator who had never lost a case against the city. Arthur sat across from Ronald's massive oak desk, reviewing the footage on a tablet. "It's a slam dunk, Ronald," Arthur said, adjusting his tortoiseshell glasses. "Excessive force, false arrest, civil rights violations. We can sue the city for $10 million and they'll settle by Friday just to make it go away." "I don't want the city's money, Arthur," Ronald said, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling skyline. "The taxpayers shouldn't foot the bill for one man's bigotry. I want Riggins." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "You want to go after him personally?" "Qualified immunity usually protects them from personal financial liability." "Usually," Ronald echoed, turning to face his lawyer. "But qualified immunity requires that the officer was acting in good faith. There was no good faith here. Dig into his past, Arthur. Men like Riggins don't start acting like this after 15 years on the force. They have a pattern. Find it." The directive was given, and the immense machinery of Scott Holdings resources was redirected at a single patrol cop. Private investigators were hired. Arthur's paralegals combed through a decade of public records, civilian complaints, and court transcripts. Within 48 hours, they hit the jackpot. Officer Thomas Riggins had a spectacularly buried history. 10 years prior, he had been the subject of an internal affairs probe for repeatedly targeting minority drivers in affluent neighborhoods. The investigation had been quietly smothered by a former police union representative, resulting in nothing more than a temporary reassignment and a slap on the wrist. There were 3 sealed settlements paid out by the city for Riggins's overzealous traffic stops. Ronald had the leverage he needed. On Thursday afternoon, Ronald and Arthur walked into the headquarters of the police department. They bypassed the standard complaint desk and took the private elevator directly to the chief of police's office. The chief, a politically savvy man named Harrison, was sweating bullets. The mayor had been calling him every hour on the hour. Ronald dropped a thick, leather-bound dossier onto the chief's desk. "Chief Harrison," Ronald said, taking a seat without being offered one. "Inside that folder is the documented history of Officer Thomas Riggins. It details his pattern of racial profiling, the internal affairs reports your predecessor buried, and the exact statutes he violated on Tuesday night." The chief looked at the folder as if it were a live grenade. "Mr. Scott, I assure you, Officer Riggins has already been suspended without pay pending a full review." "Suspension is a vacation, Chief," Arthur Pendleton interjected smoothly. "Here are Mr. Scott's terms. You will terminate Officer Riggins immediately, with cause, effectively stripping him of his department protections. You will hand over his unredacted disciplinary file to the Civilian Review Board." "I can't just bypass the union process," the chief stammered. "If you don't," Ronald leaned forward, his voice a low, terrifying rumble, "I will hold a press conference at the Oakhaven. I will release this dossier to every major news network in the country. I will file a federal civil rights lawsuit naming you, the department, and the city. And I will fund the campaigns of every political opponent the mayor currently has. I will make this your legacy." The room went dead silent. The chief looked from the billionaire to the lawyer, realizing he was entirely outmatched. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a boardroom execution. The karma was absolute and devastating. By Friday evening, Officer Thomas Riggins was officially fired. Because he was terminated with cause for egregious civil rights violations that had a documented prior history, the police union refused to cover his legal fees for the impending personal lawsuit Ronald filed against him. Riggins found himself facing a massive civil suit that threatened to liquidate his personal assets and drain his pension. He was ostracized by a department desperate to distance itself from the PR nightmare, and his face was plastered across the internet as the ultimate cautionary tale of arrogant prejudice. He had tried to assert his dominance over a man he deemed beneath him, only to discover he had picked a fight with a titan who had the power to systematically dismantle his life. The man who thought he owned the streets was left with absolutely nothing, while the man he tried to humiliate continued to own the skyline. Exactly 1 week after the flashing lights of Patrol Cruiser 44 had turned the Grand Oakhaven's valet circle into a crime scene, the midnight blue Rolls-Royce Phantom returned. This time, it arrived in broad daylight, gliding under the brass archway with silent, undisputed authority. The atmosphere among the hotel staff was electric with anxiety. Every bellhop, concierge, and manager stood at attention, their postures rigidly perfect. Toby, the young valet captain who had frozen during the incident, rushed forward to open the heavy driver's side door. Ronald Scott stepped out. He wore a sharp navy pinstripe suit, his demeanor as unreadable and commanding as it had been while handcuffed against the car. He handed the keys to Toby. "Mr. Scott, welcome back to the Oakhaven," Toby said, his voice trembling slightly. I wanted to apologize for last week. I should have said something to the officer. I should have intervened." Ronald paused, looking at the young man. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and handed it to Toby. "You were afraid of a badge, Toby. That is a survival instinct many of us are taught from birth. Keep the tip, but remember this: courage costs nothing, but cowardice will eventually bankrupt your soul. Next time you see someone being wronged, you speak up." "Yes, sir," Toby nodded, standing a little taller. Ronald bypassed the front desk and took the private elevator directly to the executive offices on the mezzanine level. He walked into the general manager's suite to find Richard Harrington frantically packing personal photographs and brass paperweights into a cardboard box. Richard looked up, his face pale and drawn from a week of sleepless nights. "Mr. Scott," Richard said, his voice laced with resignation, "I was just clearing my desk. I assume Human Resources will be sending up my severance paperwork shortly." "Put the photos back on the desk, Richard," Ronald said, taking a seat in the leather wingback chair opposite the desk. Richard blinked, stunned. "Sir, you didn't know who I was when you ran out into that driveway," Ronald said smoothly, steepling his fingers. "You saw a black man being assaulted by a police officer outside your hotel, and you put yourself between the badge and the victim to stop it. You prioritized human dignity over hotel decorum. I don't fire men with that kind of backbone. You are staying exactly where you are." A wave of profound relief washed over Richard's face. He sank into his chair, exhaling a breath he felt he'd been holding for 7 days. "Thank you, Mr. Scott. I swear to you, the Oakhaven will run flawlessly under your ownership." "It will," Ronald agreed. "But we are making a few structural changes to our community relations. I reviewed the hotel's event ledger. I see that the Oakhaven annually hosts the Police Benevolent Association's Winter Gala, offering the ballroom at a steeply discounted rate." "Yes, sir. It's been a tradition for 20 years. It keeps us in good graces with the local precinct." "Cancel the contract," Ronald ordered, his voice devoid of emotion. "Refund their deposit. Scott Holdings does not subsidize, host, or entertain institutions that harbor and protect bigotry. Let them find another ballroom. If the mayor or the chief of police calls to complain, forward them directly to my legal team." While Ronald was restructuring the ethical foundation of his new hotel, his lead attorney, Arthur Pendleton, was systematically dismantling whatever remained of Thomas Riggins's life. With Riggins officially fired and stripped of his union backing, Arthur filed a devastating lawsuit under Title 42 of the United States Code, Section 1983, the federal statute that allows citizens to sue government officials for civil rights violations. Because Riggins had acted with documented malice and outside the scope of reasonable police conduct, the federal judge presiding over the case entirely stripped Riggins of his qualified immunity. It was the legal equivalent of a death sentence. Without the city's deep pockets, or the union's legal shield to protect him, Riggins was left entirely exposed to the wrath of a billionaire's litigation team. The karma was not just poetic, it was absolute, financial ruin. Riggins was forced to liquidate everything he owned just to afford a mediocre defense attorney. The media circus surrounding the trial made him a pariah in his affluent suburban neighborhood. His wife, unable to handle the public disgrace, the plummeting bank accounts, and the revelation of his deeply ingrained racism, filed for divorce within 3 months, taking half of what little remained. When the civil trial concluded, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding Riggins personally liable for millions in punitive damages. To pay his mounting debts, alimony, and court-ordered restitutions, Riggins had to find work. But a disgraced, viral, fired police officer with a massive civil rights judgment against him was unemployable in any reputable security firm or corporate sector. 6 months after the incident at the Oakhaven, Ronald Scott stood on the balcony of his penthouse suite, a glass of aged Macallan in his hand, looking out over the glittering skyline of the city he had conquered. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Arthur Pendleton, containing a single photograph taken by a private investigator. Ronald opened the image. It showed Thomas Riggins, wearing a poorly fitting generic gray uniform. Riggins was standing in the freezing rain outside a chain-link fence, holding a clipboard. He had managed to secure the only job that would take him, working the graveyard shift as a security guard at a commercial loading dock in the city's industrial district. Ronald stared at the photo for a long moment. He remembered the exact words Riggins had sneered at him outside the hotel. "Guys like you don't stay at the Oakhaven. Guys like you work the loading docks around back." Ronald locked his phone and slipped it into his tailored suit pocket. He didn't smile, and he felt no joy in the destruction of another man. He simply took a sip of his scotch, the warmth spreading through his chest, satisfied that the universe had finally balanced its ledger. Ronald Scott's ordeal stands as a stark, unforgettable reminder that true power whispers while empty arrogance screams. Officer Riggins allowed prejudice to blind his judgment, mistaking a self-made billionaire for a criminal, ultimately engineering his own spectacular destruction. Karma is rarely swift, but when fueled by limitless resources and righteous legal fury, it is absolutely devastating. Respect is never a privilege afforded by zip codes. It is a universal right,